There are moments in life where a mere 10 minutes is enough to completely flip the script on a person's destiny. That morning, in the grand lobby of a corporation with hundreds of employees, I was slapped so hard I collapsed onto the cold marble floor. Under the stunned gaze of countless onlookers, the person who struck me wasn't a stranger. It was my sister-in-law, the powerful chief operating officer, a woman everyone bowed their heads to in fear. She looked down at me with absolute contempt, let out a cynical smirk, and delivered a sentence that brought dead silence to the entire lobby. "For trash like you, me letting you into this company is a blessing your ancestors had to beg for." I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't try to explain myself. I simply stood up in silence, brushed the dust off my skirt, pulled out my phone, and made a single phone call. When I spoke into the receiver, I said only one sentence: "Fire the COO for me." She burst into hysterical laughter, her mocking voice echoing across the grand lobby. "Who the hell do you think you are? I am the law here." But what she didn't know was that it would be the very last time in her life she would ever have the privilege to laugh like that, because just 10 minutes later, her entire empire began to crumble. I still remember that morning vividly. The sun wasn't glaring yet, and the corporate lobby still carried the faint scent of freshly polished granite. The receptionists were adjusting their sleek, light blue uniforms. The steady click-clack of high heels echoing against the floor created an atmosphere that was both luxurious and freezing cold. People bustled in and out, everyone in a rush, everyone busy, everyone wearing that signature, stressed expression of the American corporate world. I stood before the revolving glass doors, gripping the straps of my purse tightly, and took a deep breath. It wasn't my first time stepping into this building in downtown Chicago, but it was my first time entering as a member of the family. I had only been married for a little over 3 months. My husband, Mark, was a gentle, quiet man who worked as a systems engineer in his own family's corporation. He wasn't the one holding the reins of power, nor was he the golden child. He was the kind of guy who was content anywhere, as long as there was peace. But I was different. I had never believed in the illusion of peace. From the very day I became a daughter-in-law, I understood one thing perfectly clear: this family did not want me. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, a woman accustomed to living in extreme old money wealth, looked me up and down during our first meeting and delivered exactly one sentence: "This family isn't short on money. We are only short on people who know their place." The words were spoken lightly, but they were as cold as ice. As for my sister-in-law, Victoria, the woman who would later slap me in the lobby, she barely even tried to hide her disdain. She wore sharply tailored black power suits, her hair pulled into a tight updo, her lips painted crimson, and her eyes always assessing me like a cheap commodity. She looked at me, smirked, and said, "So, you're the new wife? You'll do, I guess." I just smiled and lowered my head, not because I was weak, but because I knew that smiling, in that moment, was safer than speaking. After the wedding, Mark suggested I submit my resume to the family company. He said gently, "Just come work near me. It'll be easier for us to commute together." I nodded, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't being let into the company because of my credentials. The day I received the employment email, the contents were brutally brief. Position: administrative specialist. Contract: probationary. Approved by Chief Operating Officer. Victoria's name was stamped right at the bottom. That morning, I wore a modest, light beige dress and sensible flats, trying to look as remarkably average and invisible as possible. I didn't want to draw attention. I didn't want to become the subject of office gossip, but it seemed my mere existence was already a thorn in their side. The moment I walked through the doors, eyes immediately darted my way. I heard the faint whispers. "Is that the IT guy's wife? The new daughter-in-law? I heard the COO despises her." I pretended not to hear. HR escorted me to the 5th floor. The hallway was long, the fluorescent lights blindingly bright, and the central AC hummed steadily, chilling my skin. With every step, I felt like I was walking into a place that was never meant for me. I hadn't even warmed my desk chair when my desk phone rang. It was an internal call. "Get up to the COO's office immediately." The female voice was cold and decisive. I knew who was calling. The executive suite was on the top floor. Heavy mahogany doors, expansive glass walls, and two perfectly manicured, yet soulless, potted plants flanking the entrance. I knocked and entered. My sister-in-law sat behind a massive executive desk, her back straight, a designer pen in hand, not bothering to look up. On the desk sat a massive stack of files, which she shoved toward me. Process all of this in 3 days. I was taken aback. Excuse me, which department is this for? She finally looked up at me like I was an idiot. Mine. Then she gave a cynical smile. Don't think that just because you married my brother, you get special privileges. There are no exceptions here. I silently took the files. Before I could turn around, she added one more sentence, her voice very quiet but perfectly clear. If you can't handle it, do us all a favor and quit. Don't make things difficult for everyone else. I walked out of the office, my arms aching under the weight of the files. The hallway was still long, the lights still bright, but inside me, something had quietly begun to fracture. No one in the company knew that I didn't join to cling to anyone's coattails, nor to prove my brilliance. I joined because I needed to see, with my own eyes, the true faces of the people holding the power. And I never expected that. From that very day, step by step, I was walking toward the moment I would be slapped to the floor in the lobby, only for everything to violently reverse course. After that morning, I officially became part of the corporation, but not in the way people usually describe going to work. I was like a ghost, a shadow pushed into a dark corner, existing silently, ignored by everyone yet scrutinized by a select few. My desk was at the very back of the admin department, right next to a window where the morning sun was blinding, and the afternoon sun cast a sickly yellow glare over the stacks of paperwork towering over my head. The industrial printer buzzed all day, and the smell of fresh ink and paper often made me choke. The workload was abnormally massive. Tasks meant to be split among 3 or 4 people were dumped entirely on my desk, from data entry and report synthesis to running physical documents between departments. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. This was an order from the top. Every morning I arrived early. Every evening I left late. At first, my department colleagues exchanged basic pleasantries with me, but soon they began to actively avoid me. They were afraid of collateral damage, afraid of being labeled as part of the daughter-in-law's faction. In this company, standing on the wrong side meant digging your own grave. Once, I was carrying a heavy stack of files, scanning the pages as I walked to ensure nothing was missing. A female coworker brushed past me, bumping my shoulder. The files crashed to the floor, papers scattering everywhere. I knelt down to pick them up. She stood watching for exactly 1 second, then turned and walked away. No apology, no help, as if I didn't exist. I usually ate lunch alone. The cafeteria was crowded and filled with laughter, but the seats around my table were always empty. A few curious glances were thrown my way, some pitying, some inquisitive, but no one dared approach. I got used to it. The most exhausting part wasn't the workload. It was the stares. Specifically, Victoria's stare whenever she walked past the admin department. Her eyes were icy, as if my mere existence in her line of sight was a profound annoyance. One day, she stopped right in front of my desk. "Where is yesterday's report?" I shot up, handing her the document with both hands. "Right here, Victoria." She flipped through a few pages, then slammed the folder back onto my desk, her voice bone dry. "The data is wrong. Redo it." I was stunned, but I pulled these figures directly from the accounting department's system. She glared at me, her eyes sharp as a scalpel. "Are you talking back to me?" I immediately lowered my head. "No, I'm not." She turned to leave, tossing a chilling warning over her shoulder. "Remember this carefully. In this building, whatever I say is the truth." During moments like that, I simply clenched my fists under the desk, my nails digging deep into my palms. Not out of helpless frustration, but to remind myself, it is not time yet. In the evenings, I never complained to my husband. Mark would come home exhausted, eat dinner, and sit in silence, scrolling through his phone. He didn't know, and didn't want to know, what was happening inside his family's corporation. My mother-in-law remained the same. During dinner, she would ask me exactly one question: "Is work going fine?" I would answer briefly, "Yes, it's fine." She would nod and ask nothing more. To her, whether I was fine or not didn't matter. What mattered was that I didn't cause trouble. Only I knew that with every passing day, things were being pushed further and further past the limits of normal human endurance. And then, late one afternoon while I was synthesizing data, I received an internal email. Subject line, report to the COO's office. No reason, no explanation. I looked at the clock. It was almost 6 p.m. Most departments had cleared out. The hallway was empty, the lights casting long shadows over the polished marble. With every step, the sound of my heels echoed clearly, beating like the drum of my own heart. I stood before the COO's door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," her voice rang out, cold and brief. I didn't know yet that this summons was just the prelude. And from the moment I opened that door, everything began to spiral out of control much faster than I ever anticipated. The heavy oak door of the COO's office clicked shut behind me. The space was massive, the ceilings high, and the bright white LEDs reflected off the pristine executive desk. The room was always freezing, regardless of the thermostat. The coldness didn't come from the HVAC. It came from the woman sitting behind the desk. Victoria didn't look up. She kept her eyes glued to her monitor, typing rhythmically, as if I were an invisible object that had just floated into the room. I stood there. I wasn't offered a seat. I wasn't allowed to speak. Nearly a full minute passed in suffocating silence before she finally spoke. "Do you know why I called you up here?" "No, I don't." She let out a soft chuckle, entirely devoid of amusement. "Don't know, or pretending not to know." She turned her laptop screen toward me. On it was a consolidated data spreadsheet. Several rows were circled in red, accompanied by a barrage of aggressive comments. "Look at it," she commanded. I stepped closer, my heart beating faster. "Do you see it?" "Wrong. It's all wrong." I swallowed hard. "Victoria, I compiled this spreadsheet using the exact metrics accounting sent down." Before I could finish, she slammed her hand onto the desk. "Stop making excuses." The sound echoed violently in the quiet room. She stood up and walked slowly toward me, her heels clicking ominously against the hardwood floor. "Do you have any idea how much money this company hemorrhages every day? Just one wrong decimal, and the entire supply chain goes into chaos." I bowed my head. "I accept responsibility. I will correct it immediately." She stopped right in front of me, looking me dead in the eye, her voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "Do you think an apology fixes this?" She tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Or do you think that because you married into the family, you get a free pass?" That sentence made my heart sink. I understood perfectly. She didn't care about the actual work output. She needed me to bow down. "I don't think that at all," I said. "I just want to do my job properly." "Can I?" She stared at me for a few seconds before returning to her desk. "Tomorrow morning, there is a full division meeting for the operations block. You will represent this report in front of everyone." I was stunned. "Victoria," she sat down, her tone icy. "I'm giving you a chance to fix your mistake, or are you too cowardly?" I clenched my fists. "I can do it." She smirked. "I certainly hope so." The next morning, the grand conference room was packed. Department heads, vice presidents, and staff were all present. The atmosphere was so severe that people were only speaking in hushed whispers. I stood in front of the projection screen, gripping the remote, my palms drenched in sweat. At the head of the table sat Victoria, back straight, arms crossed, her eyes freezing cold. "Begin," she ordered. I took a deep breath and started presenting. The first few slides went relatively smoothly. I fought to keep my voice steady. Every number, every chart, I had double-checked them so many times I had them memorized. But at slide 5, she raised her hand. The entire room went dead silent. She pointed a laser pointer at the screen. "Where did you source that data?" "From the accounting department." "Is there an email confirmation?" "Yes, there is." "Then why is it still wrong?" I paused for a second. "If you'll allow me, I can double-check the server." She burst into laughter, the sound ringing sharply across the boardroom. "You want the entire executive team to sit here and wait for you to double-check." A few people lowered their heads. Others looked at me with pitying eyes. She continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Or is it simply because you lack the competence? Or maybe it's because you were only hired because you're the daughter-in-law. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. My face burned hot. I was hired through the same application process as everyone else here. Enough. She stood up abruptly. Don't bring your pathetic excuses in here. In this company, if you can't do the job, you're out. She looked me dead in the eye, enunciating every syllable. And I am telling you right now, I do not tolerate incompetent parasites in my organization. The air in the boardroom turned to solid ice. I stood there, subjected to the stares of dozens of people, feeling as though every layer of my dignity was being publicly stripped away. But I didn't cry. I didn't run. I lowered my head and said one very quiet sentence. I understand. The meeting ended in heavy silence. As everyone filed out, I remained standing before the now black screen. Every word she said echoed in my head. This was no longer about work. This was a public execution of my character. And I knew that from this moment on, she wouldn't stop. Because to her, I wasn't just an employee who needed to be fired. I was a thorn that needed to be completely broken. After that disastrous meeting, I returned to my desk feeling like I had just been paraded naked through a town square. No one spoke to me. No one checked in. The admin office was still filled with the clatter of keyboards and ringing phones, but around me was an invisible, impenetrable void. I kept my head down and continued working, as if the humiliation hadn't even happened. But inside, I felt a suffocating pressure slowly wrapping around my chest. That noon, my husband texted me, "Coming home for lunch today," Mom called. I stared at the screen for a long time. My intuition told me this lunch was not going to be a casual family meal. It was going to be a lunch without a single smile. The sprawling Winnetka mansion was heavily air-conditioned. The dining table was covered in an elaborate spread of food, but the atmosphere was so heavy you could hear a pin drop. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. Victoria sat to her right. Mark sat across from me, avoiding my eyes. The meal began in silence. When my bowl was barely half empty, Eleanor put her fork down. "How are things going for you at the company?" I looked up. "I'm still trying my best." Victoria let out a soft laugh, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "Anyone can say they're trying, but if you can't do the job, stop forcing it." I gripped my fork tightly. Eleanor glanced at Victoria, then back at me. "This family doesn't lack the money to support an extra mouth," Eleanor said coldly, "but we do not need someone dragging down our corporate operations." I understood immediately. They didn't care about right or wrong. They only cared about preserving their absolute power. Mark finally spoke up, his voice meek. "Victoria, I think you should just let it go." "Shut up," Victoria cut him off instantly. "Corporate affairs are none of your business." Mark lowered his head. I watched the scene unfold, and my heart turned to ice. The man I had married was completely powerless right in front of my eyes. Eleanor concluded the meal with a blunt, definitive statement. "If you feel you can't handle the pressure, resign. Our family won't force you to stay." The words were spoken softly, but to me, it was a blatant eviction notice. Later that afternoon, I returned to the corporate headquarters to drop off a file portfolio at the executive suite. The grand lobby was busier than usual. Employees were clocking out, clients were coming and going, and security guards flanked the revolving glass doors. I walked quickly, just wanting to drop off the files and leave. But as I approached the reception desk, a voice rang out clearly, making no effort to lower its volume. "Watch where you're walking." I froze. Victoria was standing there, surrounded by several department heads. She looked me up and down, her eyes freezing cold. "You dropped a document." I bent down to pick up a few loose papers that had slipped from my folder. She crossed her arms and continued, her voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "You're careless in your work, and you can't even walk in a straight line without making a mess." I stood up straight and said quietly, "I apologize." She laughed. "Apologies? I hear so many of your apologies. Don't you get tired of it?" A few people nearby pretended to be busy with their phones, but I knew they were hanging on to every word. Victoria took a step closer to me, her voice dropping but turning razor sharp. "Remember your place. Don't think that just because you married my brother, you actually have any power here. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I kept my head bowed. Not because I was a coward, but because I wasn't ready to lay my cards on the table. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the grand lobby, clutching the files, feeling as though the entire world was looking at me with pity. That night, I came home very late. Mark asked, "What's wrong with you today?" I looked at him for a long time before saying just one sentence, "I'm fine." But deep down, I knew the absolute truth. This family would never protect me. This company was pushing me to a dead end. And from that exact moment, I began preparing for something no one could have ever anticipated, because if they chose to back me into a corner, I was going to walk out of it on my own terms. After that evening, I felt a distinct shift in the corporate atmosphere. The way people looked at me changed. It wasn't curiosity or pity anymore. It was active avoidance. Conversations halted when I walked by. Emails that used to CC me suddenly stopped including my name. Documents that required my signature as a procedural check were no longer sent to my desk. I was like a chess piece being quietly, systematically removed from the board. One morning, as soon as I sat down at my desk, the admin manager slammed a thick folder down in front of me. She looked at me, her eyes evasive. "The COO wants you to process this immediately." I opened it. It was a portfolio of old vendor contracts, accompanied by a final expense reconciliation sheet. I frowned slightly. I thought this portfolio was finalized and approved last month. The manager shrugged. "I don't know. The COO said to do it. So just do it." Her tone was light, but in my ears, it rang like an alarm bell. I took the files back to my desk and read through every single page meticulously. And the more I read, the more I realized something was dreadfully wrong. Certain financial figures had been altered in red ink. Several signature pages were photocopies, not originals. One specific expenditure had been inflated to double the amount stated in the original vendor contract. I looked up, my heart pounding. If this portfolio was submitted and processed, the person legally responsible for the discrepancy would be me. I stood up, grabbed the folder, and headed straight to the accounting department. "Excuse me, has this portfolio already been reconciled?" The senior accountant glanced at it and frowned. "That was closed out ages ago. Why are you dragging it back up?" I lowered my voice. "There are several line items in here that don't match the original figures." The accountant stared at me for a long time before whispering, "It's best you don't get involved in this. This isn't a simple mistake." Those words sent a chill straight down my spine. That night, just as I laid down in bed, my phone vibrated. It was an internal corporate number. The time read 10:47 p.m. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. "Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Victoria's emotionless voice echoed through the speaker. "We have a situation to resolve." "What situation, Victoria?" "You'll find out tomorrow." Click. She hung up abruptly. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. In my mind, the puzzle pieces began snapping together. The humiliating board meeting, the icy family dinners, the public degradation in the lobby. And now, a portfolio reeking of a setup. They didn't just want me to resign. They wanted me to leave as a corporate criminal. The next morning, I went up to the executive suite earlier than usual. 3 people were already waiting in the office. Victoria, the admin manager, and the VP of finance. The door closed. The air was so dense I could clearly hear the ticking of the wall clock. Victoria pushed the fraudulent portfolio toward me. "Explain this." I looked her dead in the eye. "There are massive discrepancies in this file. I cannot sign off on it." The room went silent for a second before she burst out laughing. "You won't sign? Are you trying to hold up corporate operations?" "I am simply fulfilling my duty." She tilted her head, her eyes as cold as ice. "Duty? Who do you think you are to talk about duty here?" The VP of finance spoke up, his tone monotonous. "If you don't sign, the person held liable for the delayed audit is you." That sentence made me freeze. "Why me?" Victoria stood up and walked toward me. "Because you are the one holding the files, because you were assigned to process them, and because you are the easiest scapegoat to explain to the board." I finally understood. They had choreographed everything. They needed a fall guy. I clenched my fists and stared right back at her. If I sign this, the legal fallout falls entirely on me. She smiled, a supremely confident smile. If you behave, I'll let you resign quietly. No harm done. I lifted my chin. For the first time, I looked at her without an ounce of fear. Because in that moment, I suddenly remembered another phone call, a connection to a man she had no idea I knew. And I knew that if they were determined to push me off a cliff, I was going to drag them all down with me. I walked out of the COO's office, feeling strangely detached. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't trembling. I was just ice cold and profoundly calm. I understood their game now, and once you understand the rules of the game, you know you can't play it the old way anymore. I returned to my desk, placed the fraudulent portfolio inside my drawer, and locked it carefully. Outside, everything carried on as normal. Printers hummed, phones rang, coworkers chatted. No one knew that, inside my desk drawer, lay a ticking time bomb. I opened my computer and worked as if nothing had happened, but in my mind, every step was already calculated. At lunch, I didn't go down to the cafeteria. I stayed at my desk, waited for the office to clear out, and reopened the portfolio. I took high-resolution photos of every single page, the altered numbers, the photocopied signatures, the red-inked adjustments overlaying the original prints. I sent everything to a secure personal email and backed it up onto an encrypted USB flash drive I kept hidden in my purse. My heart was racing. Not from fear, but because I knew I had just crossed the point of no return. If I was caught, I wouldn't just lose my job, but if I did nothing, I would lose my freedom and my dignity. Later that afternoon, I received an internal message from Victoria. "Is the file done?" I replied curtly. "I am doing a final review." A few minutes later, the reply came. "Hurry up!" Just 2 words, but I could feel the intense impatience radiating from the screen. Near the end of the workday, as I was organizing my desk, the VP of Finance walked past. He stopped, glanced around, and lowered his voice. "Be careful, Elena." I looked up. "Yes?" He stared at me for a few seconds before whispering, "This goes higher up than you think. It's not just the COO." I tightened my grip on my pen. "You mean—" He didn't finish his sentence. He just dropped a bombshell that left me paralyzed. "Do you know who gave the final sign-off on those original vendor contracts?" I shook my head. He looked at me, speaking deliberately. "The chairman of the board." My heart slammed against my ribs. The chairman. A name practically treated like a deity in this corporation. He walked away, leaving me sitting in stunned silence. If the documents I was holding implicated the chairman, then this was no longer a petty scheme to bully a daughter-in-law. This was a massive, high-stakes cover-up. That night, I went home earlier than usual. Mark looked at me, slightly surprised. "No overtime today?" I shook my head. "I'm exhausted." He nodded and didn't ask further. But when I went into our home office, I noticed that the drawer to my desk had been very slightly moved. It was a microscopic detail, but to me, it was glaringly obvious. The encrypted hard drive was still safely hidden in my bag, but a wave of anxiety washed over me. They were starting to watch me. I lay in bed, staring into the dark room. For the first time, I asked myself if I was going too far. But then I remembered the look in Victoria's eyes when she said, "You are the easiest scapegoat to explain to the board. If I back down now, I would forever be the one taking the fall." I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. A specific name appeared. I didn't dial yet, but my finger hovered over the call button, because I knew that the moment I made that call, there would be no turning back. The next morning, the moment I stepped into the corporate lobby, the atmosphere felt entirely different. It wasn't louder, it was heavier. The security guards stared at me a fraction longer than normal. The receptionists didn't greet me, only giving a perfunctory nod. A few employees quickly looked away when they saw me. I knew the timeline had been accelerated. Before I could even sit down at my desk, I received an internal call. "Get to the COO's office. Now." No please, no basic courtesy. I stood up, grabbed my purse, the encrypted USB resting quietly inside like a dormant secret waiting to be unleashed and headed upstairs. The lights in the executive suite were glaringly bright. Victoria stood with her back to me, looking out the window, her arms crossed. On her desk sat the familiar portfolio, perfectly aligned, with an expensive pen resting on top of it. "Sit," she commanded. I sat. "I'm giving you one last chance. Sign it, or you're fired." I looked her dead in the eye. "If I sign it, the legal liability falls entirely on me." She nodded decisively. "Correct. And you?" She laughed, a smirk laced with absolute arrogance. "I am merely the executive overseeing operations. The person who commits the error takes the fall." I nodded slowly. "So, if I don't sign," she leaned forward, dropping her voice, "then I will have the legal department launch an internal investigation against you. And who do you think they'll believe?" I knew they had a guilty verdict already scripted for me. I stood up and picked up the pen. She watched me, her eyes gleaming with triumphant victory. But just as the pen tip touched the paper, I stopped. "Before I sign, let me ask you one thing." She frowned. "What? Who originated these contracts?" The room went entirely still for a beat. She snapped back. "That is irrelevant." I looked straight into her eyes. "It is highly relevant, because the final signature on the originals isn't yours." She froze for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, but I had already seen it. A sudden memory from my past had returned to me. That afternoon, I had faked being ill to leave the office early. I didn't go home. I went to a small, run-down coffee shop near the business district. There, I pulled up my phone and dug through a very old, archived email thread. It was from nearly 4 years ago. Back then, I wasn't married into this family. I didn't work for this corporation, but I had worked with them indirectly as an independent data consultant. The email appeared on my screen. The sender was a name I had tried to forget for years: Richard Vance Sr., chairman of the board. My father-in-law. Back then, I had been hired to audit data for Project X. The project was suddenly and inexplicably terminated, and all documents were seized. I remembered it vividly because, during that audit, I had discovered a massive financial black hole. When I reported it, the project was instantly shut down. And the person who directly ordered me to cease my audit and bury the findings was the chairman himself. I set my phone down, my heart pounding. If the current fraudulent contracts shared the exact same financial structuring as Project X from 4 years ago, then none of this was a coincidence. Back in the COO's office, Victoria was waiting. "Have you made your decision?" I looked at her for a long time, then smiled. "Yes, I have." She pushed the portfolio closer to me, tapping the pen. I picked up the pen, but this time, I didn't sign. I set the pen down on the desk and spoke very slowly. "I need to make a phone call." She laughed. "Call who? My brother? Or are you going to cry to your mother?" I raised my head and looked her straight in the eyes. "No. I'm calling the person who gave the final signature." The smile vanished from her face instantly. The office became so quiet I could hear the hum of the AC vent above us. Victoria stared at me, a mix of shock and irritation flashing across her features. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer right away. I slowly pulled my phone out of my purse. She let out a dry, nervous laugh. "Don't tell me you're trying to bluff me. This isn't the place for child's play." I looked at her with an eerie calm. "I'm not bluffing. I'm just calling the exact person who needs to be called." I dialed the number. The phone rang for a long time. With every ring, the color drained a little more from her face, morphing from irritation to deep paranoia. Finally, the other end picked up. A deep, authoritative, emotionless male voice spoke. I took a deep breath. "Hello, sir. I am the data consultant who audited the financials for Project X 4 years ago." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of a dropped call, but the silence of a man whose brain was calculating 1,000,000 scenarios a second. I continued, my voice perfectly steady. "Today, I am holding a portfolio of vendor contracts that share the exact same fabricated cost structuring as that project." Victoria jumped to her feet. "What the hell are you doing?" I held up a hand, signaling for her to shut up. On the other end of the line, the man's voice dropped to a dangerous octave. Where are you right now? In the COO's office. With the person attempting to force me to sign off on it, the air in the room turned to solid ice. I could clearly hear Victoria swallow hard. Give her the phone. The command was spoken softly, but it carried the crushing weight of an absolute order. I turned to Victoria and held out the phone. She looked at me, then at the phone, her eyes darting in sheer panic. Take it, I said. She grabbed the phone, struggling to keep her voice steady. Yes, Chairman. Just a few seconds later, her face turned the color of ash. Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, I will handle it immediately. The call ended. She stood paralyzed, still clutching the phone, her lips pressed into a tight line. The arrogant smile, the superiority, all of it had completely evaporated. The room was dead silent. A single, brief command had been issued. Victoria turned back to look at me, her tone entirely changed. Go back to your desk. I frowned. And the portfolio? She glanced at the stack of papers on her desk and spoke rapidly. Leave it. I will handle it. I nodded and said nothing more. As I walked out of the office, the long hallway suddenly felt incredibly foreign. Employees walked past, but this time, no one dared to look at me with contempt. I knew that a single phone call had just shaken something massive to its core. But this was not the end. Late that afternoon, I received an internal corporate email. Sender, Chairman of the Board. Subject line, Mandatory Executive Meeting, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Main boardroom. I stared at the screen for a long time. This was no longer about signing a document, and it was no longer about bullying a daughter-in-law. This was the moment everyone would have to sit down at the same table and face the music. That night, I ate dinner in silence. Mark glanced at me a few times, as if wanting to ask something, but ultimately kept quiet. Before going to sleep, I sent one single text message. Tomorrow might be catastrophic. The reply came back instantly. I know. I put my phone down and closed my eyes. I knew tomorrow's board meeting would determine who was going to be thrown out of the game entirely. At 9 a.m., the grand boardroom on the top floor was brightly lit. The massive oak table was pristine, the leather ergonomic chairs perfectly aligned. The projector was on, displaying a blank blue screen. The tension was so thick that despite the blasting AC, everyone felt suffocatingly hot. One by one, the executives filed in. The VP of Finance, the Chief Legal Counsel, several majority shareholders, and finally, Victoria. She walked in maintaining her usual polished appearance, her suit immaculate. But if you looked closely, her steps were slightly hesitant, and her eyes lacked their usual predatory confidence. I sat at the very end of the table, silent, not speaking to anyone, not looking at anyone. At exactly 9 a.m., the boardroom doors swung open. A middle-aged man walked in, tall, graying hair, a face carved from stone. The entire room stood up in unison. The chairman of the board. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He didn't ask how anyone was doing. He simply gave a curt nod and sat at the head of the table. Let's begin. 2 short words, but they froze the air in the room. The audit reports were distributed. The VP of Finance stood up and clicked to the first slide. Familiar numbers appeared. The vendor contracts, the highlighted inflated expenditures. I glanced at Victoria. Her hands were resting on the table, her fingers gripping each other tightly. This portfolio, the chairman spoke up, his voice resonating across the room, was approved based on the recommendation of the Executive Operations Committee. His eyes locked onto Victoria. Explain. She stood up, fighting to keep her voice steady. Sir, these expenditures were necessary operational costs to expand our vendor network. Necessary? The chairman cut her off. Or fabricated to look necessary? The room was deathly quiet. The chief legal counsel spoke up. Our internal review has uncovered that several signatures are not original ink, and numerous line items have been inexplicably inflated beyond the scope of the original vendor agreements. All eyes shifted to Victoria. She swallowed hard. It could be a procedural error by the lower-level processing department. Which department? The chairman demanded bluntly. She hesitated. I knew she didn't dare say my name, because if she did, all eyes would turn to me, and I would no longer stay silent. I am asking you a question, Victoria. The chairman's voice boomed. I stood up. I was the specialist assigned to process this portfolio. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Did you sign off on it? No, sir. A wave of hushed whispers rippled through the boardroom. The chairman looked at me. Why not? I took a deep breath. Because the financials did not reconcile. And because I refused to be held legally liable for actions, I did not commit. The room went completely still. I pulled the encrypted USB flash drive from my purse and placed it on the table. This drive contains high-resolution scans of the original, unedited portfolios, including the physical alterations, the photocopied signatures, and the email directives ordering the processing. Victoria shot up from her chair. Are you trying to sabotage this company? The chairman raised a hand. Sit down. His voice wasn't a yell, but it was authoritative enough to make her freeze mid-sentence and slowly sink back into her chair. The truth was laid bare. The projector switched to comparative slides. The original documents versus the altered ones. The baseline figures versus the massively inflated payouts. The entire boardroom began to murmur in visible shock. The chief legal counsel spoke slowly. If these documents are verified, this is no longer a procedural error. This is intentional corporate fraud. I looked straight at Victoria. For the first time, she avoided my gaze. The chairman leaned back in his leather chair, his voice a low rumble. Do you have anything to add to this? Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she managed to squeak out a single, pathetic sentence. I was just following orders. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Whose orders? The chairman demanded. She remained silent. A long, heavy, terrifying silence. The chairman stood up. This meeting is suspended. The executive committee will remain. Everyone else is dismissed. The shareholders and junior executives stood up, their eyes filled with shock and confusion. As I walked out of the room, I knew the game had fundamentally changed. It was only a matter of waiting to see who would be permanently removed from the board. And I understood perfectly well. This was just the beginning. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut. The hallway outside was eerily quiet. Those who left walked briskly. Those who stayed nearby didn't dare breathe too loudly. News spreads faster than the wind in a corporate office, but no one dared to ask questions yet. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick. Only a few people remained. The chairman, Victoria, the VP of Finance, the chief legal counsel, and myself. The chairman stood at the head of the table, resting his knuckles lightly against the polished wood. His cold, severe gaze swept over everyone. Now, he said slowly, we are going to have an honest conversation. No one spoke. The documents just presented, he continued, do not materialize out of thin air, nor do they magically alter themselves. He turned his piercing stare to Victoria. You originated the proposal. You oversaw the operations. Explain yourself. She looked up, struggling to maintain her composure. I acted in the best interest of the company. The company's interest, the chairman repeated. Or someone else's interest. She fell silent. The chief legal counsel opened a separate file. We have conducted a retroactive audit of approval histories. Several high-level decisions were greenlit hastily, bypassing standard compliance gates. Victoria whipped her head toward him. Are you accusing me of violating protocol? The legal counsel replied curtly. I am saying the protocol was intentionally circumvented. That sentence acted like a knife. For the first time, Victoria lost her offensive footing. The chairman looked at me. And you? Why did you refuse to sign? I answered with absolute clarity. Because if I signed, I would be the sole person held legally responsible, and I do not commit actions I know to be fraudulent. He gave a slight nod. You did the right thing. Those words weren't spoken loudly, but to me, they were absolute validation. Victoria whipped her head around to glare at me. Do you think you've won? She hissed. I looked at her, not flinching. I just think I don't deserve to be the scapegoat. The chairman raised a hand, cutting off the exchange. Enough. He turned back to Victoria. You have two choices. 1. Cooperate fully with an internal investigation. 2. Step down from your executive role temporarily. She froze in horror. Step down? Temporarily? Yes. Effective immediately. The room went dead silent. You can't do this. She shot up from her chair. I am the one running this entire operational block. The chairman stared her down. And that is precisely why we need to stop you. The first major decision fell. The chief legal counsel placed a drafted document on the table, a formal resolution for the temporary suspension of the chief operating officer. Pending investigation results, Victoria stared at the piece of paper for a long time. For the first time, I saw her hands physically shake. You can't do this to me, she whispered, her voice cracking. The chairman responded coldly. I can, and I am doing it right now. He signed his name. The scratching of the pen echoed clearly in the quiet room. Effective as of this moment, there is no turning back. But that was not the final price to be paid. Victoria slumped back into her chair. Her eyes were no longer burning with anger. They were filled with panicked desperation. The chairman turned to me. You will temporarily assist the legal department. No signing authority, no executive approvals. You will merely provide necessary operational data. I nodded. Understood. As I stood up to leave the room, I heard Victoria's voice behind me, shaking with venom. Do you think this is over? I stopped, turning my head slightly. No, I think this is just getting started. The decision to suspend the COO was not broadcast company-wide immediately. At least, not officially. But in a corporation where gossip travels faster than an internal memo, no secret stays hidden for long. Just overnight, I felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. That morning, I walked into the office as usual, but this time, the eyes that tracked me no longer looked away. They stared directly, carefully, and full of suspicion. I walked past the reception desk and clearly heard a whispered conversation. I heard she went nuclear, bypassed everyone, and went straight to the chairman. She's not someone to mess with. Another voice replied, lower. But the COO just got suspended. What if the daughter-in-law is the one really pulling the strings behind the scenes? I kept walking without looking back. I knew the counterattack had begun. Anonymous rumors. In the admin department, no one spoke to me casually anymore. Coworkers who once threw me looks of pity now kept a very deliberate distance. Not cold, but distinctly wary. My work emails started receiving bizarre CC's messages, structured with perfect, rigid protocol, but layered with an undeniable sense of surveillance. By noon, I received a text from an unknown number. Learn your place. Don't think that just because someone is backing you, you can do whatever you want. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't reply, and I didn't delete it. I knew texts like this would only multiply. Later that afternoon, while taking some files down to the legal department, I ran into Victoria in the hallway. It was the first time I'd seen her since the board meeting. She wasn't wearing her pristine power suit. Her hair was pulled up but slightly messy. Her lipstick faded, but her eyes remained the same sharp and brimming with pure, concentrated hatred. You're quite the genius, aren't you? She said, her voice a low, threatening rumble. I stopped. I'm just doing my job. She let out a cynical laugh. Doing your job? Or just waiting for the perfect moment to strike? She took a step closer, invading my space. Do you think your hands are clean? Do you think no one knows exactly who you're leaning on to climb the ladder? I looked her dead in the eye. I'm not climbing any ladder. I'm just refusing to bow my head. Her eyes darkened with fury. You better remember something, she said slowly. In this company, character assassination works much faster than an HR termination. She turned and walked away. But I knew that wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. The final setup. Late that afternoon, I was called down to the grand lobby. The reason? A client is waiting for you. The lobby was far more crowded than usual. Employees were clocking out, visitors were waiting, security guards and the shift manager were all present. I stepped off the elevator, looking around, but saw no one familiar. Right at that moment, a voice rang out loud enough for the entire lobby to hear clearly. Finally got the guts to come down here, huh? I turned around. Victoria was standing in the middle of the lobby. She had dropped the hushed, restrained hallway threats. There was no more hiding. Her eyes blazed with a fury that had been suppressed for far too long. You thought you could just blow everything up and hide behind a desk? You think you're some kind of victim? All eyes immediately locked onto us. I felt a very public trap snapping shut around me. Before I could speak, she took another step forward. And I knew that with just one more sentence, just one tiny spark, the slap in the middle of the corporate lobby was about to happen. The lobby was packed, groups of employees finishing their shifts, clients in the waiting area, security guards standing rigidly by the revolving doors, receptionists freezing, their hands resting on their keyboards, forgetting to smile. Every single pair of eyes was glued to me and Victoria. No one spoke, but everyone knew an explosion was imminent. She stood less than 3 feet from me. I could smell her expensive perfume, a scent I once thought was sophisticated, but now just found overpowering and suffocating. You think you're so brilliant, don't you? Her voice escalated, sharp as a blade. Coming into my family, coming into my company. Who exactly are you relying on to act so high and mighty? A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the crowd. I stood up straight, my voice so calm it even surprised me. I stand here on my own 2 feet. The moment the words left my mouth, her eyes went pitch black. "Shut your mouth," she screamed, the sound echoing off the marble walls. She raised her hand. Everything happened so fast that no one had time to react. Smack! A vicious, open-handed slap connected directly with my face. The sickeningly dry sound cracked through the massive lobby like a gunshot. I staggered, losing my balance, and collapsed hard onto the cold granite floor. In that fraction of a second, every ambient sound vanished. The chatter stopped, the footsteps halted. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. There was only a terrifying, deathly silence. I sat on the floor, bracing myself against the polished stone, feeling a searing, burning pain radiate from my left cheek down to my neck. My ear rang violently, but I could still hear her voice echoing with absolute contempt. "For trash like you, me letting you into this company is a blessing your ancestors had to beg for. Don't think playing dirty little tricks is going to change your pathetic life." No one dared to intervene. The security guards stood frozen. The receptionists turned pale. A few people covered their mouths in shock. My husband was not there. My family was not there. In that moment, I was completely and utterly alone. 10 seconds of pure silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't try to explain myself, nor did I ask why. I slowly stood up, brushing the invisible dust off my skirt, and lifted my head. The lobby remained absolutely silent. I looked straight at her. My eyes weren't trembling. I wasn't afraid. They were just ice cold. I spoke very slowly, ensuring every single person heard me clearly. "You just publicly assaulted me in the middle of the corporate lobby, in front of dozens of witnesses." She burst into hysterical laughter. "So what? What are you going to do about it? Who the hell do you think you are?" Her laughter was shrill and chaotic, and in that precise moment, I knew it was time to end this once and for all. The fateful phone call. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. She kept laughing. "Who are you going to call now? My brother? Or are you going to cry to your mommy?" I didn't answer. I dialed the number. The phone rang. Ring, ring, ring. The entire lobby held its breath. The person on the other end picked up. The familiar, deep, authoritative male voice spoke. I spoke clearly, my voice unwavering. "I am in the main lobby. I was just publicly assaulted. The person who struck me is the chief operating officer." I paused for exactly 1 second before delivering the final blow. "Fire the COO for me." The entire lobby froze in horror. Victoria's hysterical laughter died instantly. She glared at me, her eyes bulging as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "What? What did you just say?" I didn't look at her. I only listened to the brief silence on the other end of the line before the deep voice responded with brutal brevity. 10 minutes. Click. The call ended, the suffocating wait. Victoria let out a shaky, forced laugh. The triumph was gone, replaced by frantic insecurity. 10 minutes? Do you think you're starring in a movie? But I saw it clearly. Her hands were trembling. I stood there in the middle of the grand lobby, surrounded by people holding their breath. I didn't say another word. I just waited. And in my mind, There was only one thought. These 10 minutes will decide who walks out of these doors forever. Time dragged on with agonizing slowness. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. No one left. No one dared to whisper. The entire lobby felt like a photograph frozen in time. Victoria stood opposite me, her arms crossed, desperately trying to project an aura of unbothered superiority. But as the seconds ticked by, the cracks in her fake confidence became glaringly obvious. Stop putting on a show. Making random phone calls isn't going to save you. Her voice was louder, but it lacked its previous venomous certainty. I didn't respond. I just stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Because I knew that when he appeared, any words spoken right now would be entirely meaningless. Minute 7. Ding. The VIP elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed. It was a very soft sound, but in the dead silent lobby, it echoed like a cannon blast. Employees snapped their heads toward the sound. The security guards instantly straightened their postures. The elevator doors slid open. A middle-aged man stepped out. He wore a dark, tailored suit, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying calm that instinctively made everyone in the lobby stop breathing. Right behind him were 2 other men. One carried a leather briefcase. The other wore the uniform of the head of corporate security. When Victoria saw them, all the color drained from her face. Impossible, she muttered under her breath. The man needed no introduction. Everyone in the building knew exactly who he was. The chairman of the board, the ultimate validation. He walked straight into the center of the lobby. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at me. He looked at the crowd surrounding us. What just happened here? No one dared to speak. The receptionists kept their heads bowed. The security guards stood at attention. The employees gripped their bags nervously. I took a step forward. Sir, I was just publicly assaulted. The person who struck me is the chief operating officer. My voice did not shake. It did not break. The chairman turned to look at Victoria. His eyes weren't filled with rage. They were terrifyingly cold. Do you confirm this? Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. Agonizing seconds passed. Finally, she gave a microscopic, jerky nod. Yes, I did. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The verdict was delivered right then and there. The man with the briefcase stepped forward, opened it, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The chairman took it. He didn't invite her up to the boardroom. He didn't wait. He read it aloud, right there in the middle of the lobby. Pursuant to severe violations of corporate code of conduct, abuse of executive power, and physical assault of personnel resulting in severe damage to corporate integrity. His voice was monotonous, neither loud nor soft, but every word dropped like an anvil. I am permanently revoking all executive authority of the chief operating officer. Effective immediately. The lobby reeled in shock. Victoria stumbled backward. You can't do this to me. This is just a family dispute. The chairman cut her off instantly. This is corporate business. He stared her down. And you have crossed the line. The reversal was absolute. The head of corporate security stepped forward. Please surrender your security badge and vacate the premises immediately. Victoria stood completely paralyzed. Just minutes ago, she was the untouchable executive slapping me across the face. Now, she was the one being publicly escorted out of the building in front of the entire company. She turned to look at me. Her eyes no longer held hatred or arrogance. They held only pure, unadulterated shock. I looked back at her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Because in that moment, my silence was the most devastating answer I could possibly give. The lobby erupted. As Victoria was escorted toward the revolving doors, the crowd remained frozen for a few seconds before urgent, frantic whispers broke out. No one dared to speak loudly, but everyone understood. The throne had been violently usurped. One slap had cost a woman her entire career. The chairman turned to me. Come up to my office. We have matters to discuss. I nodded. As I stepped into the VIP elevator, I looked back at the lobby one last time, the place where I was slapped to the floor, and the exact place where everything flipped. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing out the chaotic noise of the lobby. It felt like a movie scene abruptly cutting to black. Inside the wood-paneled elevator, It was just the chairman and me, standing side by side in silence. The air was heavy, but not tense. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting in his trouser pockets, his voice dropping low. "You are much calmer than I anticipated." I replied softly, "I'm used to it." He turned to look at me. His gaze wasn't scrutinizing, it was evaluating. "Do you know why I called you up to my office?" "Yes, sir." "Because I wasn't afraid." The elevator chimed, opening to the executive penthouse floor. We walked into his sprawling office. It was bathed in natural light, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. His desk was immaculately clean, almost intimidatingly sterile. He sat down and gestured for me to sit opposite him. "Tell me," he said bluntly, "why did you finally decide to stand up?" I took a deep breath. Because if I stayed silent, I spoke slowly and deliberately, I would have been the one taking the fall for their embezzlement, and I refused to accept that. He nodded. "But that alone isn't enough." He leaned forward slightly. "You know perfectly well that taking on the executive board is not a trivial matter." I looked him dead in the eye. "I know." The truth revealed. He leaned back in his leather chair, his voice a low rumble. 4 years ago, Project X. You were the one who discovered the financial black hole." My heart tightened. "Yes, sir." "You didn't blow the whistle then. You backed off." "Because I was young," I replied. "And I didn't have the leverage." He stared at me for a long time. "And now?" I nodded. "Now, I have the evidence, and I am no longer standing alone." He offered a very faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You are intelligent," he noted, "and you have a spine of steel." He placed a thin file folder on the desk. "This is an interim directive. You will temporarily assist the legal department as a consultant. No signing authority, no executive approvals. You will only provide data. I will handle the rest." I stood up and bowed my head slightly. "Thank you, sir." As I turned to leave, he spoke one final sentence that made me stop in my tracks. "You owe no one in this company anything. On the contrary, they owe you." The storm hits the family home. I got home late that evening. The lights in the Winnetka mansion were blazing, and the atmosphere was entirely different from any other night. Eleanor was already sitting in the grand living room. Mark was standing by the window, his posture radiating stress. The moment I walked through the door, Eleanor demanded answers. "What happened at the company?" Her voice lacked its usual icy detachment. It was laced with panic and anxiety. I set my purse down and answered calmly. "Victoria was suspended. Because of you?" she practically yelled. I looked her straight in the eyes. "Because of her own actions." The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Mark turned to look at me. For the first time in our marriage, he didn't avert his gaze. "What did you do?" he asked. I replied softly. "I just refused to take the blame for someone else's crimes." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've just thrown this family into?" I nodded. "I know. And I did it anyway." The air in the room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Finally, Eleanor stood up, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are nothing like I thought you were." I looked at her, my response slow and deliberate. "Neither are you." The irrevocable shift. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a very long time. I knew that from the moment that slap echoed through the corporate lobby, not only had Victoria's career been annihilated, but my position in this family had changed permanently. I was no longer the compliant, invisible daughter-in-law. I was no longer the easily manipulated admin drone. I was the woman who dared to say no, and who had proven exactly what it costs to cross me. After that day, the corporation was fundamentally altered. There were no official, company-wide announcements yet. No lengthy HR emails. But walking into the building and noticing Victoria's absolute absence was enough for the entire corporate machine to realize that a seismic shift had occurred. Departments that used to blindly follow her every command became extremely cautious. People who used to greet me with condescension or dismissiveness now spoke to me quietly, maintaining a respectful distance. I went from being a name people avoided to a person everyone watched closely. It wasn't necessarily respect, and it certainly wasn't friendship. It was sheer caution, the whispers behind my back. Walking to get coffee, I would catch snippets of conversation. I heard the COO got suspended because she threw a fit in the lobby. A daughter-in-law who bypasses the entire executive chain to call the chairman directly. She's a shark. But the COO is suspended. What if the daughter-in-law is the one really pulling the strings now? I kept walking, never turning around to acknowledge them. I understood that when you shatter the old world order, not everyone is going to cheer for you. The family loses its leverage. That evening, the family gathered in the living room again. This time, no one bothered trying to look calm. Eleanor spoke first. "Your sister called me," she said, looking at Mark. I looked up. What did she say? Eleanor sighed heavily. "She said you destroyed everything. She said you intentionally set her up to climb the corporate ladder." I let out a cynical laugh. If I hadn't done anything, the person being escorted out by security and facing federal charges today would have been me. Mark remained silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. She was crying. I looked at him. For the very first time, I didn't see him standing passively in the middle. I asked very softly, "Who do you believe?" The question dropped into the room like a boulder. He looked up at me, his eyes exhausted but clear. "I believe the truth." Eleanor didn't say another word. She just stared at me for a long time before saying something that genuinely surprised me. "You chose a very difficult path." I nodded. "I know." The final confrontation. 3 days later, Victoria resurfaced. Not at the corporate headquarters, but right on my front porch. I had just gotten home from work when I saw her standing there. No designer power suit, no stilettos, just a woman with red, swollen eyes and a deeply exhausted face. "We need to talk." Her voice had lost its arrogant edge, but it still lacked any trace of warmth. We sat across from each other in the living room. She looked at me and offered a sad, bitter smile. "You won." I shook my head. "I don't view this as a game of winning or losing." She clenched her fists tightly. "If you hadn't made that phone call, everything would be different." I looked straight at her. "If you hadn't slapped me in the middle of the lobby, you would still have a way out." She closed her eyes. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've taken from me?" I answered without a second of hesitation. "I only took back what I didn't deserve to lose." She stood up, looking at me one last time. "You won't find peace. The price for standing tall in this world is incredibly high." I replied slowly. "I've already paid the price, and I find it entirely worth it." She turned and walked out the door. As the door clicked shut, a silent, profound shift settled over the house. That night, I sat alone in the dark, looking out the window. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. It was just an overwhelming, crystal-clear realization. I had crossed the point of no return. This family would never look at me the same way again. The company wouldn't either. But in exchange, I would never have to bow my head to anyone ever again. A week after the spectacle in the lobby, an official corporate memo was distributed. It was devoid of flowery language. It was brief and brutally clinical. The chief operating officer has been officially relieved of all duties. The internal audit files have been forwarded to the relevant federal authorities for further investigation. The entire corporation fell silent. No one acted surprised. Everyone just understood that an era had truly ended. Victoria never returned. She didn't show up to clear her desk, didn't send a farewell email, and left absolutely zero trace in the boardrooms, the email servers, or the hallways she used to dominate. The person who had strutted through the company wielding absolute power vanished as if she had never existed. The final phone call. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone vibrated. It was Victoria's number. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally answering. "I'm leaving soon." Her voice was raspy and exhausted. "Where to?" I asked. "Overseas, probably permanently." I didn't say anything. A moment later, she continued, "You know, I never thought the day would come where I'd lose, let alone lose like this." I answered very slowly. "You didn't lose to me. You lost to your own actions." The other end went silent. Then, she spoke one very quiet sentence. "Take care of yourself. Surviving in that house, it isn't easy." I replied, "I know." The call ended. No tears, no screaming accusations, just two people walking away in two entirely different directions. The family dynamic irreparably changed. Eleanor changed, not necessarily becoming warmer or maternal, but she stripped away the contempt. One morning, while I was brewing tea, she said, "You aren't the daughter-in-law I thought you were." I offered a small smile. I never wanted to be. She didn't press the issue. Mark, too, was different. He stopped avoiding conflicts and hiding in silence. He began standing beside me not by yelling or making grand declarations, but simply by being present. Once, he held my hand and said, "I'm sorry for leaving you to fight alone." I replied, "You being here now is enough." My final decision. A month later, I submitted my resignation letter to the chairman. No one forced me. No one made things difficult. The chairman looked at me and asked, "Are you sure about this?" I nodded. I don't want to spend the rest of my career in a building that constantly reminds me of the day I was slapped to the floor. He smiled, a very faint, respectful smile. "You will go very far in life." I left that corporation with my head held high. Not because I had defeated someone, but because I no longer owed anyone an explanation. Looking back at everything now, I don't feel the sting of pain. I only see one glaring truth. The person who screams the loudest is not the strongest. The person with the fanciest title isn't automatically right. And staying silent does not always equal keeping the peace. That slap in the middle of the corporate lobby stripped away my naivety, but in return, it gave me the posture to stand tall for the rest of my life. If anyone were to ask me if I have any regrets, my answer would be an absolute no, because if I had to do it all over again, I would still choose to stand up. The lessons drawn from this story. Life sometimes backs us into a corner, not because we did something wrong, but because we were too accommodating. There are people who believe that possessing authority gives them the right to insult others, that holding a title gives them permission to trample on human dignity. But this story reminds us of one incredibly clear truth. True power does not reside in the executive chair you sit in. It resides in whether or not you have the courage to stand tall. Endurance is sometimes necessary, but endurance does not equate to blind submission. Silence might maintain a superficial peace, but the truth is only protected when someone finds the bravery to speak up. The woman in this story didn't win because she sought malicious revenge, and she didn't win by tearing someone else down. She won because she point-blank refused to carry the guilt for someone else's crimes. And sometimes, choosing to stand up at the exact right moment is enough to alter the trajectory of your entire life. If you found that this story sparked a moment of reflection, a pang of empathy, or if you saw a reflection of your own life somewhere within these words, please to join us in listening to more gentle, profound, and deeply authentic everyday stories. Please like the video to support the channel and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Share this video if you believe this story can offer strength to someone who desperately needs to hear it today. Thank you for listening until the very end. We look forward to seeing you in the next story on where the things that seem small can touch the deepest parts of the human soul.